Hello and welcome back to Media and Crime. I'm Dr. Jensen. It's good to see you again. And we're back in Module 1 with Part 4. And this is rounding out the rest of Predators, Pictures, and Policy. We're also going to look at the Samuel Walker article on the wedding cake model of criminal justice that you were assigned to read in this module. So if you like his work, which I do as well, you can check out a book he has called Sense and Nonsense About Crime and Justice. It's used in a lot of criminal justice courses in university classes. So he's got a lot of great writing. He's very easy to read. And if you're interested in those kinds of challenges on policy and practice, he's a really good source to use for that, especially if you're going to be writing papers. Again, I use his books in my other classes. So, with Module 1, we're going to be expanding on Chapter 1, and again, looking at Walker's work. So first, as we've already covered, crime and justice really do provide the fodder for media, not only in news, but in entertainment and infotainment. And we've already talked about what those are, because they're so dramatic as events, and we all want to know about them, because it has to do with our immediate safety. But what we also see is with greater technology that we've seen over the decades, it provides exponential sources of information for these kinds of things. So we see whole episodes of CSI sometimes that were created because of viral videos on the web, or we see dramas based on things that happened out in the public, and maybe what we would call a celebrity case or a case that was very pervasive throughout society, and now let's write an episode on that. We also see that technology has increased the ways to incorporate crime and justice. And we can look at this with now police departments have public relations specialists and media trainers to make sure that the chief doesn't look stupid on camera because they know that it represents the department. And we have media training now that they get. We also see things like surveillance and a surveillance culture where, our pockets hold our camera all the time and we can catch things on camera very easily. And we also can think about the ways that this plays out in law enforcement with body cams and dashboard cams, with court, when we look at how to transmit media reports of court proceedings, with corrections, still very closed to the media, and we're going to get into all of these in future modules, by the way. But again, it's really expanded that. And then finally, technology has increased the availability, where we can get presentations on demand 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which again is kind of new stuff. I mean, some of us are a little bit older, and we remember where you had to wait for a broadcast of a show on major network television or a film coming out to the theaters. You couldn't get on-demand streaming content. Now there are so many ways to do this, and it's commercial-free. You can get subscription services, and everything's digitized. You can take it with you anywhere, and you can watch it anytime you want. So YouTube, remember, is 2005. So probably for many people, they didn't necessarily grow up with this. They experienced most of their childhood not dealing with streaming and all these kinds of things. But their adulthood has very much been captured by this. So let's continue. When we look at media and technology, technology has also introduced interactivity. So audience members can become active participants in crime and justice, where we can chime in on how we think the investigation's going. We can provide tips. We can make comments on a judge's ruling and those kind of things. We also can capture and submit images, as we talked about with the cameras. We can provide instant tweets about events and share them. We can vote instantaneously on policy debates and weigh in on them with commentary. We can engage in and manipulate virtual reality, where we have whole websites set aside for us to kind of feel out our fantasies and incorporate sometimes some sensational events. So consider how this plays out in a learning process. If you know anything about University of Florida, you know that we had Ron Akers in our department for a long time. He's emeritus faculty now. And he is the proponent of social learning theory, looking at things like reinforcement and modeling, as far as us taking things that are presented to us and mimicking them and putting them into our daily practice. So we'll use learning theory to a certain extent in this class because of the work of Dr. Akers. It's a very strong theory, and it does really well in criminology. And I know I've been honored to work in the same department as a major celebrity criminologist and a great colleague. So again, when we think about learning theory as we've studied it, maybe in other classes under Dr. Akers, we think about knowledge and beliefs and where we get our ideas and thoughts on these kinds of things. So we get involvement with those that we model, even if it's virtual and they seem real. So oftentimes I would get students to work with law enforcement and show them how they might approach someone to investigate a vehicle search, or kind of initiate some kind of stoppage on the freeway, where you have a driver step out of their car, you suspect drugs. So what are the things you would say? What would you do to try to get that person to cooperate and get the information you need? Always what happens is students mimic what they see on TV and in movies, and it's often wrong, and it will get you laughed out of police academy. And I'll bring this up later too. But people in law enforcement go, nope, that's not what we say. Nope, that's going to get you in trouble. Nope, that's now illegal. Nope, that can be challenged in court. And you make mistake after mistake because your knowledge and beliefs about what cops say, how they act, and what they should or shouldn't do is coming from places that you see play out because you don't have any experience. So all of these things are drawn from someplace else, often informed by media. Again, we can see a wider but more immediate reinforcement and punishment mechanism working here too. And we're going to look at the research as we continue in this class to say, how much do we mimic what we see? How hard do we subscribe to these ideas? Aren't we a little skeptical sometimes? Or don't we know that's a movie and it's not real? It's just a story. Or is there such a thing as copycat crime, where people try to take something they see on TV and play it out in real life? So we'll talk about what the research says about the plausibility of those things. We've also kind of begged the question currently about who is a reporter. And again, this is a theme we'll return to as well in the class. So social media have really multiplied the number of reporters and bloggers, people hosting their own channels and so forth, reporting and commenting on crime and justice. Things like rogue news stations, as we brought up earlier. So again, the direct effects are obviously on the audience members themselves, where we start to confuse authentic media outlets with ones that are not so authentic and not accurate. There also are some indirect effects because these sources are used by institutionalized media sometimes to convey messages and themes. We recycle and loop these kinds of things to wider audiences, transforming that idiosyncratic event into a cultural event with a sense of popular mainstream importance, something we reference for how things play out, even though, again, it might be very suspect and inaccurate. We also talk a little bit about info sharing in this moment of social media as well. So technology has really changed how this information is shared, where we all are actively consuming a lot of information. So in some ways, the audiences can be broader, like when information is posted or looped through institutional media, or when a post goes viral over the internet, or a tweet or a video. Other ways audiences are targeted through what we call narrowcasting. And we're going to get more descriptions about what narrowcasting is, just like I promised you. Or sometimes it's shared through like-minded people who you may be friends with on Facebook or other social platforms, who really reinforce limited points of view and are all kind of talking about the same side of things, same perspective. So let's get into narrowcasting a little bit more. When we talk about narrowcasting, we're going to talk about what it is as compared to regular broadcasting. So consider these implications. Broadcasters, as we know them, were successful only if they could find enough common ground to expand their audiences. So they're very careful about how they present the facts. They know that a lot of different people are watching, including people who are fact checkers, who are expert witnesses, who are people that can verify and document the truthfulness of a statement. So they know that they have to be very strong in their story with good sourcing and before it goes to air, before its dissemination or printed. Narrowcasting, on the other hand, are freed from that constraint. So they thrive on a very loyal audience that shares a content interest, like people that subscribe to your channel or your videos. So we all like the same things. That's why I like to know if you're going to post a new video. Narrowcasters can succeed by cultivating and sustaining differences, and those differences retain the loyalty and create things like in-groups and out-groups, people like me, people different from me. And these distinctions contribute to group solidarity and group identity and reinforce who I am, what I like, and what's important to me. Does narrowcasting contribute to the polarization in society? I think we can say we've seen some effects of this, where suddenly you have whole camps that people join in on, and it starts to be a competition of who you're friends with, who you subscribe to, how many subscribers you have, and of course that generates revenue for narrowcasters. So we have to think about that juxtaposition between the broadcasters and the narrowcasters. We also talked about in the Surrett text memorial justice policies, and there are examples of this as you probably already read about. So essentially a memorial justice policy is really a crime policy enactment taken after and in memory of a highly publicized case or individual. So Megan's Law, which requires sex offenders to register with their state, that was named after Megan and the case that she experienced. And then we have Amber Alerts, named for the victim Amber when she was abducted. Okay. We also have things like Miranda warnings, named after a groundbreaking court case about a person knowing the rights they have upon arrest. We have memorial justice policies raising the prospect that media are important in criminalization. And this is going to be picked up a little bit later as we continue. So essentially, does the increase in sources and all these people on the media landscape giving us a sense of higher frequency of crimes? And we can say that that might be informing those opinion polls, thinking that crime is increasing when it really isn't, and that, you know, they have more fear or they think things are really going badly in society. It has to do with exposure, with frequency of news, with intensity of it, with salience, how important it is to them, the priority it has in a person's life, and all of these things we can measure and observe to see what's going on. Do frames of media contribute to a changing policy? I think we can argue that it does. When we identify frames, and we've talked about some of these before, that really help us see it in a certain perspective. And that perspective is very persuasive in helping us come to a conclusion on what policies we should support, who we should vote for, how we should interact with the police, and how we should think about victims, inmates, offenders, and so forth. We're going to wrap up with Walker's wedding cake model of criminal justice. So remember, he kind of painted this portrait. So at the very top of the wedding cake, which doesn't represent most crime at all, you have celebrated cases or celebrity cases. It doesn't necessarily mean that the offender or victim is a celebrity. It just means it's someone that is pervasive. It's a case that's on all the channels, and these are often cases that are depicted into TV specials, movies, or maybe kind of copycatted sometimes, but celebrated cases are ones that everyone knows. So these would be things like Casey Anthony, things like O.J. Simpson, Timothy McVeigh, Ted Bundy. So these are really the exceptions to criminology rather than the rule because of how much attention we paid to those cases. On the second layer of the cake, we have serious felonies. So this is the violence and the horrific crime that is most newsworthy and worthy of entertainment, infotainment, and drama. And that's usually a violent crime. And then we have lesser felonies, again, also considered, significant, but they're not necessarily violent. They might be drug felonies and so forth, prostitution. And then at the very bottom, which actually represents most crime, we have misdemeanors. A lot of petty offenses. They don't necessarily interrupt daily life, but they're a nuisance, they're bothersome, and we don't want people doing them. But again, they're not terribly exciting to talk about. Okay, so we're going to go through this wedding cake model to give you some more detail and understanding about how it all kind of works. So again, it provides that telling lesson about media depictions of crime and justice. So again, the top layer are the celebrated cases, which are few in number, atypical, but they get heavy media coverage. These are fodder for narratives and frames about crime and justice playing out in entertainment and infotainment, not only news, but they also are the ones media present to their audiences. So they've been deemed the most newsworthy, and they can often take over an entire broadcast. The next layer, the serious felonies, which again are relatively few in number. These are the murders and the assaults and the robberies. They do not represent most crime. They're a very small percentage of most crime. But they're often of violence involving strangers. You get some limited media coverage, but they're significant enough to be newsworthy. The next layer of lesser felonies, these are much more common, but involve less serious crimes, with many of them between familiars, people that get into fights, people that know each other. There's very little media coverage here. You might see it on a slow news week where there's not much to report. You may see that layer broadcast occasionally. And then the bottom layer gets almost no coverage at all. Misdemeanors, which are far most common, the most common kind of crime committed. But again, it may not involve direct victims or victims we can identify with, and there's almost no media coverage. So we have a very lopsided view of what crimes actually occur and what actually gets reported. And this very much informs our perception of the kind of society in which we live. So we'll get more into the implications of this in future lectures. But we'll leave you with this, and see you next time.